I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.
It's my pleasure to be here with Michael Sheehan. I'm assuming that most of you know him, but I thought I would give him a brief introduction anyway. Something I've been trying to get correct for the last 8 years. I'm going to try really hard to get it perfect today. Brief and perfect, that's hard. Mike began his career as an expert in counterterrorism with the U.S. Army in the Special Forces Counterterrorism Unit. He moved on and has done many jobs at the international and national level. He was worked on counterterrorism in the White House. He was the head of the peacekeeping force at the UN. He was most pertinent to this conference in particular, at the NYPD as the head of the counterterrorism unit. He was a fellow at my center, which was at NYU. Which has now moved to Fordham University Law School. And for all of these reasons, he has the on-the-ground experience to talk about counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, and the larger world into which the story of Al Qaeda and other terrorist narratives fit. I should also say that he wrote a book called Crush the Cell, which is very much about how to address terrorism and terrorists, and something that I suggest that gets more timely over the years. And I suggest you take a look at it to understand and to flesh out some of the issues that came up in the earlier panel. So we're going to have a little chat here about terrorism, about domestic terrorism, and about some of the larger issues that concern New York and the nation. The first thing I want to start with is sort of following the last panel, which is in terms of a threat assessment, which is everybody's talking about today. Brennan is out giving a speech, I think, at Harvard to talk about it. Washington is abuzz with it. Many people say the threat is over, but the narrative remains. The network isn't quite as strong as it was, but the affiliates are something to pay attention to. I'd like to hear, before we get into the nitty-gritty of today's talk, just how you can tell us how to think about threats and threat assessment when it comes to Al Qaeda and affiliates.
Well, thank you, Karen. In part of, we're going to talk about the report that we've written. It's in the final draft now. We'll release it soon. That looked at the threat of Al Qaeda from the viewpoint of the United States, instead of looking at it from its origins, and mostly in Pakistan, Afghanistan, a couple other spots around the world. We looked at it. Okay, what is their actual projection capability to the U.S.? And we looked back at about 40 case studies dating back, starting with Ramzi Youssef, who I consider sort of an operational precursor of Al Qaeda. He was actually way ahead of Bin Laden in many ways, although he didn't have as sophisticated a narrative as Bin Laden. But we looked at that all the way through. But I've also followed for all my years, including when I was State Department before 9/11, looking at Al Qaeda threat. And I think I'd associate myself with some of the remarks that made here that clearly their operational capability has been degraded dramatically. And I wrote in my book that that was primarily done between December of 2001 and the middle of 2003. That Al Qaeda really was significantly degraded then and thrown out of Afghanistan. Losing those camps, as Brian Jenkins said, was crucial to diminishing their strategic reach. Also, within the last few years, I think that when John Brennan comes out and talks about the degradation of their operational capability, again, I think he's right. By the way, it's very risky for counterterrorism people to say that. It's much safer to say that they're 10 feet tall and around the corner. But the fact of the matter is, I like to always quote Bill Parcells, a football coach for the Giants and the Jets, and he says, "You are what your record is." And quite frankly, you know, you can have all the excuses in the world and near misses, and actually I don't believe that near misses have anywhere near the impact of a miss. I really don't subscribe to that. Yeah, they try to take credit for it and say it was successful. The fact of the matter is near misses don't count except in hand grenades, right? But the fact of the matter is between 1998 and 2001, when I was working on these guys at the State Department, they conducted 3 strategic attacks in 37 months. That's about 1 a year. They hit our embassies, the USS Cole, and 9/11 attack. 3 strategic attacks in 37 months, and now attacks against the U.S. homeland for now, if it's been 10 years, it's really 0 for 10. Although I'll give them some credit for the Fort Hood killing by Major Hassan. That guy was motivated by the narrative. So he can be considered perhaps the only successful hit on the U.S. in 10 years. That is a dramatic degradation of capability that is just plain factual. I also take issue with the assumption that the American people are going to overreact if there's an attack tomorrow. I also that's kind of an assumption like Americans can't take casualties. Well, they can take casualties. They just have to know why. And we can take a terrorism attack too. If we understand our country's doing everything that we can do, but sometime every once in a while somebody's going to slip through, I think we're going to respond much differently than 9/11 next time. I think we'll take a page out of how the Israelis and the British respond, and I think we'll look at it, we'll move forward in stride and not allow them to, it was remarked earlier, I think by Chris Sticky, that it's a psychological attack. I think we're much better prepared from that. And even if they do attack us tomorrow, it's still only really 1 attack in 10 years. That really constitutes a major strategic degradation of their capability. And now some people say they've diffused and they've sort of changed their model. That's true. But in my view, that's not a strategy of choice. That's a strategy that's been forced upon them because their operational center has been basically dismantled. Surely they have capability in certain parts of the world to still to wreak havoc, but their ability to reach into the West has been very limited. To Madrid in 2004, London in 2005. Other than that, it's very limited. A lot of near misses, a lot of the near misses were not so near. And I would include the Times Square bomb attack. That was a very amateurish bomb. And also the Heathrow attack, what a lot of people talk to. They were a long way away from, in my view, from having a functional bomb on that plane. So basically, to sum up, is that they have been degraded. And Americans should take, we have a hard time giving ourselves credit because everything becomes so politicized. But in fact of the matter is, our CIA, our Special Operations Forces, our FBI, those are the 3 main agencies dealing with threat, have done extremely well in the last 10 years.
And just to follow on that, the death of Bin Laden, was it more of a symbolic end to something that has already been dismantled, or is it a game changer, or both, maybe?
I think it's important that he's off the scene. I think that's a major blow to Al-Qaeda. Some people say, oh, he'll be propped up as a martyr. Yeah, sure, fine, but he's dead, and it's good. And I'm waiting for Zawahiri next. Yep. And so I think it further degrades the organization. And quite frankly, when we talk about this, the other agencies that are affiliated with Al-Qaeda, the Lashkar, the TTP, and others, yes, they are, but not so much. They have more of a local agenda as well. Not as messianic as Al-Qaeda. They're a little different. They seem now to be taking up some of the banner of Al-Qaeda, but actually their agenda is more focused at what they would refer to as the near enemy. What bin Laden did to Al-Qaeda and to this fledgling movement was he focused it on the far enemy. The rhetoric was against Israel and the U.S., but the attacks were mainly against the U.S., mainly because he had no presence in Israel. He couldn't generate anything. He would love to have, I think. But so I think that getting bin Laden was important, getting Zawahiri is going to be important, and to keep hammering that number 2 or 3 guy, keep killing them off, I think it has a significant impact. And we have a hard time taking credit for that in our government.
Let's turn a little bit to the home scene, because this report that you supervised for the Madison Policy Forum is all about domestic terrorism. Right. How do we assess it, and what what kind of danger we're in, what kind of motives there are. Can you sum up, I mean, you have a lot of conclusions, but can you sum it up in terms of the threat you see coming from what we call the homeland?
Yeah, I'll try to do that. And first, I'd like to thank a lot of people in this room, or at least in this conference, who are deeply involved in that, and I appreciate it. John Miller's here. Arpietti, I think, is in the afternoon, was very helpful. Mike Tiffany, as I see in the back, and a few others. So I miss you, I apologize. But I had a lot of help in sorting this thing out. And Phil Mudd, also former FBI and CIA, really helped me make sure we kind of got the case studies right. And there's about 40 of them, and you could add 10 or other ones or subtract 10, but it just kind of gave, here's a snapshot of what Al-Qaeda and the movement has done in the United States, as I said, starting with Ramzi Youssef and coming up to the most current cases. I've came to the conclusion that the threat is pretty constant, really, from 1993. And particularly, you actually see more successful killing attacks in the United States prior to 9/11 than after 9/11, coming from this broader movement, starting with Ramzi Youssef. But I see at the end, starting around 2009, a bit of an uptick in the seriousness of some of the cases. And basically, we point out the Times Square bomber, Shahzad, Najibullah Azazi, again referenced before, the guy who wanted to come to the subway in New York City, and perhaps the most dangerous guy in the U.S. since Mohammed Atta and Ramzi Youssef. Those are the gold standard operatives, those two guys, Ramzi Youssef and Mohammed Atta. Perhaps the only guy of that sort of ilk is David Headley, who really is associated with Lashkar-Taiba, not Al-Qaeda. And David Headley, though, was a serious guy involved with the Mumbai, planning the Mumbai attack in November of 2009 in India, their sort of 9/11. And he was in the U.S., and he was connected to these organizations. He was a capable, smart guy, sort of the capability of Ramzi Youssef and Mohammed Atta. When I was at NYPD, I used to always ask my guys, find that guy. And I actually did a study on what constitutes that guy. Those are hard to come by, the Ramzi Youssefs and Mohammed Atta. The very dedicated, the skilled, the determined, charismatic in order to get a group together of people with enough operational security and tradecraft to actually conduct an attack successfully. Most of the guys, as I wrote in my first chapter of my book, when I described Al-Qaeda as killers and bunglers, sometimes both at the same time. Most of the time bunglers, left alone, they can be very deadly killers. That was really the conclusion of my book, and still is today. If we take the pedal off the metal on these guys, they will be back and kill us in numbers. But right now, with the pressure we're putting on them, it's been hugely successful. So in the United States, you see a constant stream of these wannabes, and the narrative is strong, and the individuals that want to act out is there, and it's constant. What worries me is the connectivity to a serious organization that enables them to travel abroad and get training in explosives and other tradecraft. It's very difficult to conduct a serious strategic attack as a lone wolf. Very hard, not impossible. Timothy McVeigh and one other guy, that was a pretty good attack. So it's not impossible. But the Major Hassan's attacks, a guy with a 9mm, quite frankly, to me, that's just part of the landscape of the United States. We had a killing the other day on, these sort of rampage killings are in the papers every couple months. And eventually one of them is going to be an Al-Qaeda associate, and I think we're just going to have to work our way through that. Those are very difficult to intercept. But they also do not threaten the national security of the United States. They do not constitute a strategic threat to this country. What does is a major strategic blow with a catastrophic attack, or a series of small attacks that keep coming and coming, that would terrorize our nation and affect us. To me, their capability to conduct either of those is greatly diminished in the U.S. But the narrative is strong still.
Okay, so in terms of the threat, understand that, and I understand your emphasis on the intelligence and collecting intelligence and being preventive. But in terms, one of the things you talk about in this report is what works to identify beyond just looking for the kinds of suspects that you're talking about. And you have a number of categories of how these people come to the attention of law enforcement, and I thought you might want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so the other thing I tried to do with these case studies is kind of take a look at who these guys were, what type of threat they really constitute in the United States as sort of a way to project forward. Too much analysis after 9/11 was made by quasi-experts projecting what they would do if they were Al-Qaeda, and projecting an organization that got very lucky on 9/11 and projecting that they were going to be able to do that continuously. They were very wrong for years. And so I like to analyze, what they actually, who they are, what they actually do, and try to look around the corner, but don't come up with wild projections that are not justified by their past or current capacity. Now, the other part of the study was what actually worked in thwarting these attacks. And by the way, a lot of these 40, about 8 or 10 of them, we failed to thwart. Like, for instance, the Times Square bomber. I remember someone getting on TV and saying this attack, the T-shirt guy in Times Square, foiled this attack. No, he didn't. He saw a smoking van. If that bomb had worked, he would have got blown up. So that was a failure to identify, and we missed some points on him. And same thing with the Detroit, Abdul Muttalib coming in Detroit on Christmas a few years back. Failure to identify, to connect the dots and prevent somebody from attacking. But what I found was actually I changed my initial disposition because I thought I was going to come up with purely an intelligence model. And I still think that's about 2/3 of it. And I clumped it into 3 categories other than the fail to detect. One was, and probably I think the most important for the most serious ones, is overseas U.S. intelligence operations, primarily by CIA and NSA, HUMINT and SIGINT, but also as John Miller always reminds me, also through some of our interrogations with FBI and CIA teams. And yes, that's an important part of it. That's part of this foreign intelligence apparatus, feeding leads to the JTTFs in the U.S., to the FBI, where they follow up, conduct the investigation, and intercept and plot. That, to me, where that connectivity is between the foreign intelligence and the domestic intelligence, where that comes together and works well, to me, that's the most important, and our studies showed that seemed to be the most important element. The second element was just pure domestic intelligence collection done by the JTTFs and by organizations like NYPD that both do it with the JTTF and unilaterally. The third category, which I added, which I did not expect to, was the issue of community tipsters. And I found that there's actually a significant number of those that led to the unraveling of plots. And most of these tipsters were not the result of some program. They're really just a result of just honest citizens recognizing there's something violent that may happen and calling up the FBI or the local police department. And those were the 3. I tried to strip away any predilections I had and just looked at my cases. I tried to drill down on how was this thwarted, and those are the major 3 categories I came up with. The foreign intelligence link, U.S.-led, with a liaison with foreigners, FBI, JTTF, and some NYPD, and thirdly, community tippers. There's a few other ones out there.
Local
police stops, car stops, 1 or 2 of those, but the 3 big areas were those. And so I recommend that in the future, that's what we want to focus. Continued foreign intelligence collection, integrate it well with the FBI. I don't think we're quite where we need to be yet with that. Between the CIA and the FBI, there's still seams in the process. There's still some coordinated conflict, but dramatically improved since 9/11. And then also the JTTFs in the U.S. is the primary vehicle for disrupting plots in the U.S. And then this community tipsters thing, I think, is really important. And the good news about it doesn't require a big program. Doesn't need federal funding, just needs common sense. If you see something, say something. And I recommend also in my report, Karen, that you don't send counterterrorism people to talk to the community. Send your normal public affairs people out there, the community affairs people. Talk about the potholes, talk about the light, talk about the bar that's too noisy down the street, talk about the other issues that they have, crime, pot around the school. And then at the end say, by the way, please give us a call if you see anything suspicious, whether it's criminal activity and drug trafficking, and also if you see somebody acting who may be a terrorist. Leave it in that. If you send a counterterrorism guy into that environment, you're going to have a big foreign policy debate. It's going to get you lose. It turns into a debate about American foreign policy in Iraq and Afghanistan or Israeli policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And you lose. So just go in there and talk about traffic lights, stoplights, drunkenness, the issues that people have, and then raise that and just have that connection. And that's where the local cops really play a role. They're connected to the people, and they need to have the people energized to be their eyes and ears because they're everywhere. And so I think that's one area where I really became convinced it's very important.
We're going to take your questions in a minute, so get them ready, but I'm going to ask one more question that you can answer, which is, you said that the experts after 9/11 were often... Quasi-experts were often off the mark. And I'm curious about how you would assess the learning curve in these 10 years. Are the experts now people that, do we have our minds around this? Or?
I actually believe it's, again, much better. Okay. And so I think a lot of the hype mongers of the first few years after 9/11 have faded off the scenes. The people that referred to this as World War IV, the Islamofascism stuff, I mean, it just showed a very flimsy understanding of the nature of the threat. Not to downplay the threat. I mean, I've been working on this since 1980. I was beating the drum about Al-Qaeda prior to 9/11 at the State Department. And I get some backhanded compliments for that in the 9/11 Commission report, but quite frankly, I didn't beat the drum loud enough. But then after 9/11, I just tried to keep things in perspective. And I agree about the issue about when we overreact to a terrorist attack, we really empower them. And in my book, I talk about how the Israelis and the British do it so much better. But I believe that we'll be better next time around.
Your questions back there. Wait for the microphone and please identify yourself.
My name is Neil Sullivan. There's been a lot of talk about the Arab Spring, and it's a harder sell with Al Qaeda today among young Arab or Muslim men. What do you think of that?
Well, one thing, I'm a counterterrorism guy, not an Arab expert, although they obviously have had to become somewhat one, but I'm not an expert on the Arab Spring. I'll say this in regards to terrorism about it. Number one, Al-Qaeda was not a player, or none of those groups were. Completely off the agenda. Again, shows you how irrelevant they are in the masses in the Middle East. The Muslim Brotherhood, yes, but that's different. So, and what I think about the Arab Spring, as a counterterrorism guy, I'm worried in the short term that there may be some gaps in security that are out there. There may be some opportunities for groups to operate in places where they really had pressure on them. But in the long term, it's clearly going to be much better for us, them, and the entire counterterrorism process over time. But in the short term, it could be difficult because the Muslim Brotherhood is going to become a bigger player in the political scenes in a lot of these countries. And Muslim Brotherhood is not Al-Qaeda, but too often they can be a feeder to it. So there can be some short-term challenges, but in the long run, it's a good thing.
Chris? Wait for the microphone, please.
Yeah, just following on the Arab Spring question, isn't there a specific operational problem as a result of the Arab Spring, which is that over the last many years, we've come to depend on those dictators and those intelligence services for extremely important cooperation in fighting Al-Qaeda. I mean, right now, Human Rights Watch is having a field day leaking all the documents from the intelligence headquarters in Tripoli, Libya, showing the cooperation with MI6 and the CIA. But the same was true in Egypt, the same was true in Tunisia, the same is true in Yemen. Are we flying blind out there now because these dictators are coming down?
I don't think so, Chris, and I think the reason is because the military and intelligence apparatus in most of these countries still is intact. And I believe they will work with us on this issue because it's in their interest, not because we have good talking points. not because they really care about an attack on U.S. shores. They will work with us because these guys threaten them, and they're going to understand that. But as I say, there may be space for them as the political environment opens up, because Al-Qaeda likes to hide itself sometimes within more popular groups, extremist groups that have more popularity than them, and they can embed themselves in there and gives them space to operate. So that will be an additional challenge for us. But again, I go back and I say, I think they recognize the threat for them personally, and I think we'll be able to sustain those relationships and continue to put the heat on Al-Qaeda infrastructure or other organizations as they pop up in those countries. And again, this is where the CIA has done an extraordinarily good job since 9/11, working with the liaison intelligence services of these countries to really put the clamp down on them. I remember in 2002, I was predicting that Indonesia was going to become the next hotspot for Al-Qaeda because it looked very bad. You had the Bali attacks, it had Al-Qaeda franchise set up there, you had this broad Islamist movement where they were embedded in, and there was some other attacks, but you know what? The Indonesians decided, not us, that they weren't going to put up with this. And we helped them, but they did it mostly on their own and have basically crushed Al-Qaeda in Indonesia. So a lot of those so-called franchises that many people predicted were going to pop up all over the world have been squashed in many countries. And normally it only takes one attack where a country really turns on them. That includes countries in Europe, Asia, or other parts of the world. One Al-Qaeda attack and they're like, hey, who are these guys? What are they doing blowing up our people? Let's get after these guys. And then you see them really diminished in that country.
Of course, you would accept Somalia and Yemen from that, or where would you put them in that description?
Yemen worries me a lot. Somalia less so. I spent 9 months in Somalia, and nobody wants to go there, including Al-Qaeda. It's an awful place, and it's very difficult to operate out of there. And those clans that are in Somalia, they're very local, and they don't really have a global agenda. So they may put up with some of these guys for a while, but I think Al-Qaeda is going to find it a difficult operating environment. Yemen they're there, by the way. They're in Somalia. So yes, we have to stay on them. We have to worry about these Al-Shabaab guys who may get turned from a local fighter into an international terrorist. So Somalia is clearly on the agenda, but to me, Yemen is much more problematic. That's probably, after Pakistan, is the number one problem.
Over here.
What was the tune that you were beating on your drum before 9/11, and how has your thinking evolved since then?
Well,
on that specific subject, Al-Qaeda.
I ran into Ambassador Khalilzad at General Petraeus' retirement the other day, and he said, I sat on a panel with you in 1999, and you were saying the shift of terrorism threat to the U.S. has moved from the Middle East to South Asia. And you just kept saying that over and over and over again. And people were saying even at that time Hezbollah was the most dangerous terrorist group in the United States. I said, it's not. The most dangerous terrorist group in the United States is Al-Qaeda. And it's shifted to, and it's coming out of Afghanistan and Pakistan. And these guys are very dangerous. And that was prior to the U.S.'s Cole and 9/11. So what I was trying to do is really focus attention on that. And what I was trying to do is bring pressure on Afghanistan. And, you know, I was the ambassador for counterterrorism in the State Department. I didn't have many levers. But I was with a small cabal of people in the U.S. government that were trying to raise the profile of Al-Qaeda. But quite frankly, no one was listening. And this is not a political statement, because in my book I talk about the presidential debates. The third presidential debate was 7 days after the USS Cole attack. And it wasn't raised by either Governor Bush or Vice President Gore in that debate. It just wasn't on the agenda of either political party, of either candidate, of the questioners from the audience questions, nor in the press the next day. Nobody even recognized that this was barely discussed, barely mentioned. 17 sailors were dead, $1 billion warship almost was sunk, and no one cared. And so that was it. The issue was not understood until 9/11, and then we woke up like a sleeping giant that was stung by a wasp in the eye.
over here.
I'm struck by your recurring use of the term narrative. What is
The narrative, yeah.
What is the narrative?
Yep.
Do we have a realistic chance of influencing the narrative? And are there other narratives out there that also worry you?
Yeah, the narrative is, I think Mitch hit it pretty well. And primarily it's a political agenda. And it's traditionally been focused on Israeli, actions in Gaza and the West Bank, and U.S. actions in the Islamic world, whether it be the first Iraq War, our intervention in Somalia, and then obviously since 9/11, Afghanistan and Iraq have become this cause célèbre. But they had plenty of issues before that, and they'll have plenty after those. So it's a political narrative that's drawn out of a frustration of their own situation of power, of this humiliation. But it's really, and then it focuses on this political agenda, and as Mitch talks about, it wraps a very twisted Islamic justification for violence as the vanguard of this revolution. So that's basically the narrative. And so it's compelling. They can show footage of Americans killing Muslims on video, and they can, raise up a lot of ire about that. The part of the narrative that is falling apart for them is the use of indiscriminate terrorism. And the reason is primarily because Muslims are the ones who are dying mostly. They've been very ineffectual of attacking the West. Most of their attacks are in the Islamic world, and Muslims get killed. So, for instance, I like to always talk about the attack in Jordan where they blew up a wedding and blew up all these, this wedding couple in Jordan. And I mean, that just crushed them in Jordan. I mean, who could support that? And I think other guys like Zarqawi in Iraq, became just a madman killer, with YouTube cutting people's heads off and stuff like that. And also, they can't resist killing Shia, and so they've just really fouled it up, and it's really cost them, in my view. The narrative, that part of it, the indiscriminate terrorism that kills them. But the political narrative, it's very hard to counter while we're so active overseas. And that's not a recommendation we don't become active overseas. We got to do what we got to do, but they will always have a narrative. They'll find one.
What about the reference in the prior panel to this sort of pan-Islamism and sort of a sense of victimization of Muslims around the world, and particularly in the United States? Is this part of the narrative, or is it a growing part of the narrative, or is it irrelevant?
There's two narratives, and some of the narrative, you have to understand, comes from some of these westernized Al-Qaeda guys that read American press. And they'll drum up issues that have some resonate somewhat within the U.S., social injustice and trampling of the human rights of certain people. But really, that's not the Al-Qaeda narrative. The Al-Qaeda narrative is about U.S. presence, is about Israel in the West Bank. It's about the U.S. presence in supporting Arab dictatorships, killing people in Iraq and Afghanistan, occupying countries. That's their political, that's what they talk about. They don't rarely get into talk about social injustices because they're not interested in that if they gain power anyhow. Look at the Taliban. So, so that's really the focus of their narrative. We often talk about that their narrative is about social injustice and poverty. It's not. That's our vision of the problem, not theirs. So you have to read what they say, and particularly what they say in Arabic or Urdu. That's their real, and that's that frustration and humiliation, that political frustration, the political humiliation that becomes personal, and wanting to strike out violently, and then wrapping an Islamic justification for that violence around that core political humiliation and frustration. That's just my view, by the way. There's some who vary on that. We're out? Yeah. Sorry.
I want to say that for people who spend their lives like I do, like Mike does, thinking about terrorism, I don't know if this is true for Mike, but it's true for me who came to the game late, there's a distinction, I think, between those who were paying attention to bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and terrorism prior to 9/11 and those who, like myself, learned about it of late. And I think it has a lot to do with the unevenness in the expertise. So I could go on, I could talk with Michael Sheehan forever about this. There's much more he has to offer, but we're out of time. But I think you recognize that we're very lucky to have somebody like him helping us think about this threat and how to face it. So join me in thanking him.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.